My name is Candace Batycki, and I'm the BC and Yukon Program Director for the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And I think her screen is actually highlighted there, is Nadine Reynolds, and she's our program manager for this region. And I'll be facilitating, and Nadine will be keeping things running smoothly. So this session is being recorded. I see the recording has already begun. And beginning with the acknowledgement that, in fact, we're meeting in virtual space on planet Earth, which is kind of interesting. And it's kind of all Indigenous land in that sense. Nadine and Gwen and I are all in Nelson, BC, which is situated in the Kootenay-Columbia, the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, Sinixt, and Silt Okanagan peoples, the Kootenay-Columbia, not necessarily Nelson. We've had a great response, as Nadine was saying, over 120 registrants and a very diverse group of people, which is also very exciting. We have some Indigenous people with us. We have some provincial and local settler government people, recreation groups, tourism folks, forest industry folks, researchers, NGOs, community people, just really a great cross section. So that's really gratifying. We really appreciate that you have your cameras on. That's really nice. And we also appreciate that for lots of folks, in our sort of new reality, working at home can mean that you have to go off camera sometimes. We understand that, but we do hope that you'll keep your camera on as much as possible, especially during the breakouts. And we also recommend speaker view when Gwen is presenting. So this is a series, the first in a series of 3 one-hour sessions that build on each other. We wanted to let you to be clear about the objectives for these sessions. Primarily, this is a learning experience for non-Indigenous people about Indigenous authority. And that's why it's called Getting Ready, this first one. The second objective, though, is relationship building among us all. So we really appreciate the mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here today. And the third objective is really to set us up more effectively to work together, which is, of course, follows on relationship building and following on educating ourselves. So this is a pilot project that we hope will lead to more engagement in future. We see dialogue as a lived experience of ethical space, and Gwen's going to talk about ethical space very shortly. We all have blind spots and we all make assumptions, but together we can help each other see and illuminate these, and we can only do that together. And we also want this learning to be practical for you in your own domains and to share these learnings in your own networks and circles and constituencies. So the outcomes are we are hoping for would be a deeper understanding of Indigenous frameworks and reconciliation concepts, a sense of being part of a network of peers that are engaging with these questions, and a feeling of inspiration, empowerment, and support for taking next steps individually and within your organizations. So Gwen Bridge is our presenter today, and I'll introduce her in a moment. There will be 2 opportunities within Gwen's presentation for you to dialogue with 2 of the other participants, with your peers. So those will be small breakout groups. They'll be just randomly generated. And these won't be recorded, and you won't be reporting back on them. We won't all be coming back on plenary and hear from group 1, 2, 3, 4. These are just an opportunity for you to reflect and share on the specific questions that are linked to the material. And so those 2 breakout dialogue opportunities will be 6 minutes. So there'll be 2 minutes, basically 2 minutes for each person to speak. And Nadine will flash up a little reminder when it's time to switch. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gwen Bridge. Gwen has worked with Indigenous peoples in the USA and in Canada to improve their relationships with industry, governments, and non-governmental groups, foster economic advancement and resiliency, and empower communities for over 20 years. Gwen has worked in protection of Indigenous treaty and constitutional rights through land use planning, negotiation, Indigenous law, research, strategy development and planning, and program development and management. She has advised British Columbia on the land use planning modernization process and is a co-author of an updated effective practices guide, Land Use Planning by First Nations in British Columbia. Gwen's industry relations have included negotiating agreements with Fortis, BC, BC Hydro, and other renewable energy producers. She has been recently providing advice to federal and provincial governments on specific strategies for the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly in land management. All of Gwen's work is predicated on securing continued and enhanced opportunities for the exercise of Aboriginal rights, including the rights to economic benefits from traditional territories. Gwen is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. And I will pass it over to you, Gwen.
Thanks, Candace. Thanks, Y2Y, for the invitation to speak to everyone today. And hi to all those people who I know are on the call. Thanks for joining in. I'm going to start the presentation by sharing my screen, and then we'll work through a presentation. As Candace mentioned, there'll be 2 breakout opportunities throughout the presentation. And if you do have any questions that come up, just note them down, and then at the end, I'll have my email address, and so you can correspond directly with me should you so desire. All right, thanks. All right, so hopefully you can all see my screen now, which is a PowerPoint presentation which will guide our conversation here, or my presentation here today, rather. So Y2Y, as Candace mentioned, is putting together this series on ethical space and invited me to talk, to sort of describe ethical space and describe how we might begin to think about the application of ethical space within all of our work, whether we're working with Indigenous people or in broader government and even private industry. It's all relevant to us. So I'll present my thoughts on how that what ethical space is and how that process will roll out. So here I've called the framework for the future. This is really about our opportunity to think what we need to do, all of us collectively, organizationally, individually, to really move forward the equality in society and achieve reconciliation. Okay, so this is what I'll talk about today in sort of 3 components. What do we need to know? So really there's a whole bunch of sort of basic foundational components that prepare us for understanding our role in reconciliation, our role in the implementation of UNDRIP, and our role in ethical space. And why do we need to know all these things? Why are we doing this work? It's really beyond it's the right thing to do and may offer us insights and opportunities to guide the evolution of society. It's also been mandated by both the federal and provincial governments here in Canada and in British Columbia specifically. And then what happens when we know it? So we set out those things we need to know, and then we understand why we need to know those things. It sets us up for creation of something better in the world. And when we know these things, we can then practice with open-mindedness and creativity to help us all move forward into a more equitable future. So here's the some foundational components. I'll talk about UNDRIP and then sort of the BC context in particular. So United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was developed after decades of work in 2007. And it's really the highest level of international guidance endorsed by Indigenous peoples. And it's not legally binding to those states that sign it. But anyways, Canada endorsed it in 2016, and it's developed 10 principles for working with Indigenous people towards the implementation of UNDRIP, and those are of course available on the Canadian website. But they have not committed to the application of the articles of UNDRIP in law or legislation as of yet. The US, for those of you who are in the US, the US endorsed with caveats in 2010. Again, I'm not sure of the status of all of the work that's happening in the US in relation to the implementation of UNDRIP. It doesn't sound like there's a whole lot going on. It's been overshadowed by things like Black Lives Matter, which is super important too. But and then in BC in particular, and last year, BC passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We call it DRIPA. And so this act was really to, and I'll talk about it a bit later, but essentially it was to ensure that all new legislation and laws coming into force in British Columbia adhere with UNDRIP to make sure that all of those articles are explicitly applied within new legislation. And we'll go through some of those really relevant articles in just a moment. I want to say though, overall, UNDRIP, I think there's 49 articles, and we've all probably flipped through a booklet or seen particular rights. One thing is, I think it's Article 32, but anyways, the free, prior, and informed consent article. There's a lot more in UNDRIP than that particular article. That's an important article, but I'll go through some of those important articles. But the overall points of UNDRIP and the way that I'm framing it in really this three strategy commitments that when states sign on to it, they're really saying that they'll do this. One is that the states will acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights. So yes, what are those rights? We acknowledge and recognize them. Two, it will protect those rights. So it will ensure that in the case of BC and DRIPA, that those rights will be protected going forward into the future. Thirdly, many of the articles really reference this requirement that states pay to protect, redress, mitigate impacts to all of those rights. So that's an important component when we think about what the states signed on to when they signed on to UNDRIP, particularly BC, which is one of the only jurisdictions in the world which is actually committed to the application of UNDRIP in law. So those are those three components in summary of what UNDRIP really is guiding us to do. So as I mentioned, it's really a guide for governments. It was developed by Indigenous people to help support the state's understanding of its obligations to Aboriginal and Indigenous people throughout the world. I'll talk about a few articles here which are really relevant to land management, to conservation planning, to the work of Y2Y, but to the work of us all, really, when we think about how we're going to manage this land going forward, interact with this land going forward, have a relationship with this land and with each other. So Article 11.1, it says right of Indigenous people to practice and revitalize cultural, spiritual, and religious traditions. So this is really important because the cultural traditions which really frame out the obligations, responsibilities, and relationship of Indigenous people to the land are critical to our understanding. So not only, my point here is that, well, our point of UNDRIP is that they have this ability and a right to practice and revitalize cultural, spiritual, and religious traditions, which means that those who are also practicing other myriad traditions, for example, Western science or Canadian government, also have to understand how to work with and how we understand what each of those things are for each nation. And in BC, there's 8 nations at least, and then 208 individual bands. So there's a lot of uniqueness to this article. Another important article that I like to think about when we talk about implementation of UNDRIP is this Article 13, the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, and philosophies, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. But here, this right to transmit to future generations histories, language, oral traditions, and philosophies, it's really important because what's happened in Canada anyways is we've had the systematic extinction of and state-sanctioned extermination of the ability to practice, to transmit those to the future generations history, like the potlatch ban and those kinds of things. So it's really important when we think about that article. There's lots contained in there. Whoops, now I went wrong way, excuse me. I'm gonna try and get back here. I'm on slide 23. Okay, never preview, backwards preview quickly, sorry. All righty. Okay, so now I should be able to just click on here. There we go. So Article 18, the right to participate in decision-making and to develop Indigenous decision-making institutions. So we know that what's happening now, the current contextual, the legislative context now is that the provincial and federal governments make decisions as per the legislation and law. What this really says is Indigenous people have the right to determine their own decisions for their land, their society, their culture, and to develop Indigenous decision-making institutions, i.e. governance bodies, which will make decisions that are relevant to all of those things above, including their cultural practices on the land. So it's really about land-making decisions. So if BC has committed to the recognition of these rights and committing to support those rights, then it's really, well, how do we begin to develop the mechanisms and the processes to ensure that this happens? Okay, Article 20, Indigenous people have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institution to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all of their traditional and other economic activities. This is really important because it really speaks to the economic component. And so what's happened typically in Canada, in BC, to some extent in the United States as well, is that economic opportunities have been denied Indigenous people because they haven't participated in the decision making. So there's all of these things. So my point here is that when we begin to look at how we refine our economic models to be more equitable, to be better for the earth, to be more, there's a conservation economy is a term that's somewhat used, but it's also sort of this Indigenous economy. What does it mean to be able to support the Indigenous economic opportunities, both traditional and subsistence, but also modern and economic? In BC, the Delgamuth case obviously said that this economic right evolves along with the people. So it includes the component of modern economic opportunities, whether that be through a conservation economy or whether it be through, for example, mining or forestry or other types of resource development opportunities. So how do we begin to support and develop in partnership those types of opportunities? All right, Article 24, this is important because the traditional medicines, it's the right to traditional medicines, other vital medicine plants, animals, and minerals. So there's nothing really that protects that in Canadian legislation. We have the Species at Risk Act, for example, but that's really built on an assessment from a purely scientific and biological point of view about what's important. And Indigenous people may or may not agree with that perspective, but what's contained here is like, how do we build the systems that will ensure that this right is protected? And it could be, we don't know all what those medicine plants and animals and minerals are, but they do exist across the land base. And part of our obligation on the Western side is to understand what those things are. And on the Indigenous side, our obligation is to bring those forward. So that's important there. Okay, Article 25 is the right to maintain and strengthen unique spiritual relationships with and responsibilities to traditional lands, waters, and other resources for current and future generations. And when I talk later a little bit about a conceptual framework for our understanding this becomes a little bit clearer. But really, it's if we recognize those rights, and those rights are responsibilities, because that's what Indigenous people have told us, that so then they have this right to have the responsibility to traditional lands, waters, and other resources for current and future generations. And it's particularly important, as we know, in BC, where there's very few treaties signed, so all of the land is traditional land. So it's really important to understand that when we're talking about the implementation of UNDRIP, we're really talking about our collective responsibility to ensure Indigenous people have the ability to exercise those responsibilities to the land and water and other resources. That's really, really critical and fundamental to how we think about the application of UNDRIP. Another point here, and just a couple more points, these are some of the key points that I've pulled out of UNDRIP. And so I think that it's important when we talk about UNDRIP to really start to get into the weeds, because the pragmatic implementation of UNDRIP in our day-to-day lives will require specific strategies related to particular articles and our deep understanding of what this means for all aspects of our work. So Article 27 is to establish and implement with Indigenous peoples a system whereby Indigenous peoples' laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems are recognized and Indigenous rights can be adjudicated. So when I talked earlier in the previous, I forget what Article 13 or 14, whatever it is, about Indigenous decision-making institutions, it includes this legal adjudication system, which is all of that work of governance and the legislative frameworks which guide our behavior as societies. And we'll get in a little bit into that in a little bit more. But what's here is that Indigenous people's laws are recognized, right? So there's a lot of work happening within Indigenous communities to articulate and codify those laws in English. And that's really important because when we collectively view those laws, it's really about how we begin to apply them. And that's what I'll say here, I suppose, is just we have Indigenous people articulating and codifying their laws. We have non-Indigenous people in the current legislative framework needing to be responsive to that. And so a little bit on in the presentation, I'll talk about how we can begin to do that. But here it's just the point to be made that this is going to happen, right? And so Article 29 is that Indigenous people have the right to conservation and protection of the environment and productive capacity of their lands, and that states shall establish and implement assistance programs for Indigenous peoples for such conservation and protection. So here, there's a lot of conversation in Canada about Indigenous protected and conserved areas and how we're going to move forward to do that, and how the Canadian government and et al. Can support this movement, right? And so it's really important to just reflect upon Article 29 is that states really have this obligation to support Indigenous people in that conservation. And so what does that mean? Is it something like a competitive program like the Challenge Grant, or is it something more comprehensive and responsive to the recognition and protection of this particular right? I know in British Columbia, Article 29 has been a subject of conversation in the land use planning conversation, for example. So it's really good. And my point here is like, these are all great things, and there's an evolution of progress towards increased recognition of rights and equality in society generally. Let's keep pushing so that we can keep pushing the pragmatic elements of implementation. Article 31, Indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, et cetera, et cetera. So what here, my point here is this manifest their sciences, right? And I'll talk about what science is in some Indigenous contexts, i.e. traditional ecological knowledge, and how it differs from how we typically view science from the Western way of Earth observation and Earth knowing. But that the right is it has just as strong, or if not stronger, role to play in the way that we think about science's writ large role in defining how we interact within our societies and with the earth. I'll talk about that in a minute. In conjunction with Indigenous people, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. So I know I keep hitting on this point because it's something that I think the states have begun to recognize, and it's an interesting kind of point. Like, it's a little bit of editorializing. Like, Indigenous people wrote UNDRIP and said, this is the good thing to do. But then it was really like the states, Canada and BC, decided to adopt it, right? And so we're still sort of, Indigenous people are still almost at the, there's this benevolence or largesse of the states that we're like, okay, excellent, the states agreed to do this. And so therefore we have this opportunity. My point is that there's still not equity in there because the states decided that it shall be so, whereas the Indigenous people had already decided, and that wasn't enough. So it's not quite there yet. This is an excellent thing, but that recognition of equality of rights and the ability to self-determine is really important, and it's going to require the evolution of society and state governance. And I speak states here as in all states, like countries and states and provinces, that kind of stuff. Okay, so what should we do to implement UNDRIP? And I talked about trying to really think about some of the pragmatic implementation steps. So there's sort of three things that we would, that guide our work here. We have sort of the legal basket, the policy basket, and the practice basket. So I'll talk briefly about those things. So legally, BC and UNDRIP has stated that all new legislation will be consistent with UNDRIP. So this is an excellent opportunity for all of us, including in particular First Nations, to really, really articulate the specific strategies that for each article that's relevant to their particular set of priorities, to tell the province what needs to happen, right? Because the province doesn't know, it's not an Indigenous entity. It really needs to be guided in this way. So a lot of the Indigenous peoples and groups I work with, it's like, well, let's be really clear about what the next steps are and how exactly we want the provincial government to be responsive in its new legislation. One of the problems in DRIPA is that it doesn't define how to rectify the existing legislation, which has not been very good at the requirements of UNDRIP to recognize, protect, and provide redress for impacts to rights. So how do we do that? But in BC, we think most recently of the Water Sustainability Act, for example, which just came out a couple years ago, I think, wherein there's no mention of Indigenous rights whatsoever. So that would be very, very inconsistent with DRIPA, because it doesn't do that. So that's going to be an old model. I don't know if there's opportunity to move back and redo or revise that Water Act, because certainly that's something that First Nations have been saying since the Act was contemplated, is that there's no ability, there's no recognition of our rights at all, right? So how would we continue to, quote unquote, manage water in an environment, in one regulatory environment which doesn't recognize Aboriginal rights, whilst some Indigenous groups are developing their own water quality standards, for example, water laws based on traditional law, that kind of stuff. So we're going to need to, whether or not the Water Sustainability Act becomes consistent with new law, really find a way to meet UNDRIP when we're dealing with water management and reconciling these two legal systems, or two sets of legislation. New laws, Indigenous laws. So I said these are coming out all the time, and they're going to be necessary to guide our work. And then government to government relationships. A lot of these, the most recent Lake Babine I just learned about this week is that trilateral government relationships to really frame out a whole manner of things, whether that's, all the sort of land management and also governance relationships. And there's all kinds of things around social and education and language and all that kind of stuff. So that's, work is going well. So then policy. So we have sort of that legal environment of DRIPA. We have policy work has really guided a lot in frameworks for relationships. For example, there's the land use planning modernization framework that's coming out of MIR ultimately, which is really looking at how these policy guidances can be responsive to UNDRIP. And so that work is going on. And planning in general, really, there's a lot of, in recent work, the work that I worked on, and then Paulus has come out with a watershed planning document. It's really about how we begin to think about the role of planning, and how planning methodologies differ and their relevance to thinking about what planning looks like in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about how sort of science and technical methodologies of planning will differ. And yeah, there's some more work with the Planning Institute as well, coming out on sort of the concepts of indigenizing planning, and that'll come out in the new year sometime. Practice. So this is where really we can get into, as collective practitioners, as Candace mentioned, sort of we want to build this community of practitioners. How do we do this work? How do we think about those things, bring forward the legislation, the policy, the UNDRIP, the Indigenous laws, and talk about it, right? And so one way that I've been working to do that work of understanding two systems, but there's a beautiful phrase, and I really like this ethical space term that Reg Croshu, he's a Piikani, I think, who talked about how we would begin to have these conversations. And he used this term ethical space, which is really something that's, it's like a forum for dialogue, which is based on deep understanding, both of process and content that you bring forward into these conversations. So we'll talk about more of that in a minute. And then in practice, sort of, a lot of organizations are doing principles, like we know the federal government has principles for Indigenous relations, we have the provincial government does, I know Y2Y has Indigenous principles, many municipalities are doing these principle-based guidances, and they can inform how you work together on MOUs. And the point here in the principle-based intentions is to really think about how we can create sort of codify this idea of open-mindedness in the questioning of assumptions, and how we work together in a principles-based way. So lots of excellent examples of that, which really guide our organization and our individual behavior within organizations. And then creativity, right? So this is a new space. We know that UNDRIP is not law, but it's DRIPA is law in BC. And really there hasn't been any tests. Like in a common law system, it's like, okay, well, what are those precedents for the cases, and how does that shape the application of law. We don't have that for DRIPA, right? And so we have a creative space in which there's the boxes, the lines around the legal box are amorphous. They're not hard and fixed. And so it's really an exciting time. We can create something and we can do it a lot better. So this is now time for a conversation that is a breakout conversation. And the question here is really for you to reflect on what your organization is doing regarding the implementation of UNDRIP and or DRIPA. So just what guidance have you been received? What guidance have you provided? All this kind of stuff. So I think Nadine will facilitate those breakouts now. Thanks. And we'll come back and we'll get into reconciliation and ethical space.
Okay, we'll open up the breakout rooms now. I think everybody's in a group of 3. There's one group of 4, and you can, I'll give you a note at the 2-minute mark morning, but everybody has a chance to talk about this question. See you soon.
Hi, can anybody hear this? Not working.
Hi, Ross. I can hear you.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of names on my screen, but I can't hear or see anybody.
Okay.
I
Let me.
logged out and then logged back in to nothing.
Oh, that might be why. Okay.
Well,
Let me.
it happened before as well, so
Oh, shoot. Okay, I can assign you to
it's
a
fine.
new room. I'll put you in, I think 5 only has. Okay, I'll put you in there, okay?
Sure.
You should have an invite now. Kind of lost track of exactly the 2 minutes.
But mostly rural.
It is a fine line to walk, absolutely.
Wow. Okay. Am I unmuted?
Someone
Muted?
is. I think we're all back now. Thanks, Nadine. I hope you guys were able to have a good short conversation about this question. We're going to move right along next to reconciliation. So what is reconciliation? So we know from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which was established to really explore the impact of residential schools on Indigenous societies, that reconciliation has 94 calls to action in order to achieve reconciliation across society. There's many of them, you can review them at your leisure, but one of the fundamental components that came out of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission is really consistent with this land management theme or land relationship theme. So what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said is that in order to reconcile, the first relationship that must heal is the relationship of Indigenous people to their land. So this is the first relationship that must heal. And so how do we achieve that? This is the you know, our calling, our set of work is to really think about how we can support this to happen. And so before all of these other things, these 94 calls to action, which is, there's a lot about education and social justice and language and all that kind of stuff. In order for all that to happen, in order for us to achieve reconciliation, firstly, the Indigenous people must heal their relationship to land. So how to reconcile. So what does reconciliation mean? As I said, there's no one definition for sure. The dictionary definition is that, you know, two groups or peoples who were in conflict are now no longer in conflict. So, you know, take that for what that means. But there's something that we need to think about when we're thinking about reconciliation is what are we trying to achieve? What is the vision of reconciliation for us individually, for us organizationally, and for us societally, right? And so I have this, there's been a long-term metaphor talked about two-eyed seeing, right? And so my point here is when we think about that metaphor and we think about whether we're seeing only from an Indigenous lens or a non-Indigenous lens, is that in either case, we're seeing out of only one eye. And if you close one eye, right, then you're only able to, you can still see the vision, but if you work towards it and then you try and bring the second eye in, you're going to miss where you were heading, right? And so in order to really get clarity and the appropriate three-dimensional depth to that vision, to achieve that vision, is to use both eyes. If we're only using one eye, we can't get there because both eyes will have that vision in a different place, right? And so that's really, you know, when we think about a literal metaphor for two-eyed seeing, that's really useful for me in terms of how we need to collectively define the reconciliation vision. So, and so before we can reconcile, we need to see what that other eye is seeing, right? So we think about our brain, and in the next visual, you can kind of get this analogy. If we're taking two-eye information and we're utilizing our brain to put that vision together and to reconcile those two eyes, we really need to understand what both eyes are seeing, right? Otherwise, we can't create that vision in our mind's eye or in our pragmatic work, right? And so that's really exciting. I really like that metaphor, actually. So that's quite good when we think about ethical space. So if you're taking this sort of Western eye and this Indigenous eye and you're putting these eyes together, you have to create that vision when you bring those things together. If you, and this is the point that Reg Croce made, is that like we're evolving into something new, right? We have the Indigenous culture. It's still good. It's still there. It's still intact. Same with this Western written culture. It's got its own legacy and heritage and validity. But what do we create in here when we're creating something new? And this great document by Reg Croce with the Alberta Energy Regulator, Voices of Understanding, really is the most best way that I've seen ethical space explained. There are other ways, though, which have been applied in practice, and I'll move through these quickly because it's important to understand that this work is being done. So this was the work of the National Advisory Panel, which was really the work that the federal government, the panel that the federal government put together to try and provide guidance to the federal government on how to achieve the Aichi Target 1, which was 17% terrestrial conservation by 2020. We now have new targets, which are exciting political targets of 25% terrestrial conservation by 2025 and 30% by 2030. But the point here is that the National Advisory Panel really looked to how it could guide that conservation work and thought about ethical space and thought about what that means. And so they thought that ethical space is formed when two societies with disparate worldviews are poised to engage each other. It's a thought about diverse societies and the space in between them that contributes to development of a framework for dialogue between human communities, right? And then you do this work and then you come up with some kind of reconciliation. They've talked here, reconnecting with Mother Earth beings and laws, right? So what goes into ethical space? Information from federal, provincial, and territorial governments, Western scientific method, things like Robert's Rules of Order, process stuff, knowledge stuff, legislative stuff. So, and same on the Indigenous side, Indigenous ways of knowing, oral tradition systems, stories, etc. So another body of work that was done by the Indigenous Circle of Experts, which was again part of the work that was designed to guide the federal government towards its achievement of the Aichi target. And this was, though, written exclusively by Indigenous, well, not the Indigenous people guided this work. It was from an Indigenous perspective, and it's called We Rise Together, Achieving a Pathway to Canada's Target 1 through IPCAs, right? So when Canada said, okay, we're going to preserve all this land, it really became clear that the only way they could do that was with the cooperation of Indigenous people, because there's not enough quote unquote federal land in Canada to be able to do that. So they thought about, well, how would we do that? We really need to get into this discussion about everything that's important to us and what all of those things mean. And so a key point here in this ethical space conceptual framework is that it really says, okay, written systems, so the non-Indigenous tradition, and the oral systems, or the Indigenous traditions, and what's contained within all of those things, right? On the Indigenous side, it's the Indigenous knowledge systems, language, legal traditions, cultural customs, traditional protocols, secret teachings. And then on the non-Indigenous side, it's the Canadian government, provincial governments, to territorial governments, all of the associated regulation and policy. And so I'll go through that in a minute, but really this is just one of the key points that came out of the Indigenous Circle of Experts conceptualization of ethical space is that when we have these dialogues, we're doing this cross-validation, right? So one of the points that Reg Crociu makes is this deep understanding is without judgment. We're just learning, we're setting aside our assumptions about which system is better and validating each other's systems. So that's quite good. I'm just trying to. So when we think about what's in these systems, like what is contained with them, we have all this kind of stuff. But then when I was thinking about it with my colleague, Rob Edward, out of Lower Similkameen, we really thought about, well, when we start thinking about all of the things we need to discuss, what became clear is we have to understand that there's a hierarchy of authority and the legislative framework which guides the behavior of society. And the outcome of the behavior of society is what we see around us now. We see various types of decisions being made with various results. And one that I often think about is climate change. Like we have climate change as a result of a series of decisions made within a particular legislative framework or systems of belief, i.e. a societal construct, right? So when we were thinking about, well, what are these differences and how do we really embark upon deep understanding, it kind of became clear that to me and to Rob, is that this is when we think about there's different ways of thinking about the authority or the legislative frameworks which guides behaviors, and they're different between Western and Indigenous societies. So I'll go through what this concept, how this concept begins to frame out and how you can perhaps apply it in practice. It's really, so we have two societies, right? We have I'm going to make sure I can use my pen here. Yeah, we have, oh no, I can't use my pen. Hang on a second. Sorry, this pen issue. Okay. Use pen. No, use highlighter. Sorry, talking to myself. Pen. Okay. There, that's good. Okay, cool. So we have in these two legislative frameworks or hierarchies of law, really. We have on the Western side things coming from God, and on the Indigenous side things coming from Creator, right? And so my point here, my assertion is that there's no judgment about which one is better or which one should be dominant. They just are two out of the infinite possibilities in the universe for societal constructs, right? So we're like, okay, well, neither is good or worse. They're both equally valid and credible in the universe, in whatever this finite time and space is we happen to be living in. But they are a thing, right? And they do guide all the behavior of society. So in the Western society, the Canadian constitutional framework and the American too, comes from this notion of God, right? And then in Canada, it goes to the Queen, right? The authority comes from God to the Queen. Then it goes through to the Constitution, to legislation, to policy, and then science and management. And I'll explain here why I put science and management at the bottom in a moment. But we just compare to the sort of Indigenous framework. And this is not a pan-Indigenous framework. I'm not speaking for all Indigenous people in BC, in Canada, in North America, around the earth. This is from my experience working with Indigenous people, being an Indigenous person. So, each Indigenous group may have a different way of thinking about it, but there's we've been working with this framework for over a year now, and it's resonating really well with a lot of different people, including Indigenous people. So here you have authority comes from the creator to the earth, given to the earth. The earth sort of tells that authority through story, which directs protocols and management principles, and then living, right? So this is just how things are in the Indigenous side. And again, if it's your Indigenous tradition is different, that's totally fine, wanting to explore all that kind of stuff. The point here is that the information that's actually in the earth is actually an authority, right? If we think about this as a legislative framework or a hierarchy of legislative authority, the earth actually has legislative authority. The information from the earth is law, right? It has that inherent authority. Whereas on the non-Indigenous side, you'll see that there is nothing speaking from the earth's point of view until we get to a way of knowing that's observation-based. It's called science and management, right? So when we think about what the earth tells us on the Indigenous side, it tells us through story, and that story actually is law, right? And so down here we have science and management, which is really, okay, we're going to observe the earth. Both traditional ecological knowledge and science observe the earth, take learnings from the earth. It's a way of earth knowing, right? And the difference here is that in science, we have information derived from science is really hoping to inform policy and legislation, right? And what happens here is that when we're talking about watershed planning and things like that, I was reading this document from policy. It was like, well, we hope this plan, informed by science, will inform policy and legislation, right? So you're thinking, okay, well, hopefully you can make our earth knowing can make some dent into this policy and legislation at the discretion of these people who are controlling politics and policy and that kind of thing, right? On the other side, you have the earth, the information that's contained by the earth or the earth knowing, i.e. science, directly informs behavior, right? It's the highest level of the law, right? So there's no question about what happens when you're living or when you're doing something. The law comes from the protocol and the story. Sorry, my printer's making some weird noise. I don't know what's up with it. So what happens when we're talking about these conversations that we're trying to have with each other around earth knowing, i.e. science and TEK, is that when you're thinking about science and you're thinking about, okay, well, we understand and it's a valid way of working. What happens is you're like, okay, TEK person, let's talk about it. Let's try and integrate your knowledge into our plan, our watershed plan, or our scientific document. You're immediately subjugating this highest level of law to science, and to try and integrate it and subjugating it to policy and legislation with the hope that it has some influence over policy and legislation. Where on the Indigenous side, that is the law. That's the highest level of the law. So you can't possibly subjugate it and hope that it has some kind of influence. So this is what happens when we're having these conversations and why it's so hard to quote unquote integrate TEK into science, because you're not talking about simply the observation of an earth value, but all that's contained within that observation and story and the authority that's contained within the earth and the stories that come from the earth, right? So where you're really talking about more of an equivalent level of authority related to the Queen or story to Constitution, for example. In some negotiations, we're talking about the National Park Act. Okay, well, we really got to adhere to that. That's a really important thing in our law and our hierarchy of legislation. It's like, okay, well, that's cool. But what's that equivalent thing on the Indigenous side? It may be, in this case, horse story. It's a story. It gives us guidance, and it's the law about how we behave and we interact and we live, right? So we have to, when we're thinking about that, understand at what level we're working at and how we can begin to think about the relevant place to have these conversations. And when you're trying to have conversations which subjugate the highest level of the law to the lowest level of law, it's really difficult. And again, this is not a judgment. This is just the way it is, right? And so, when we're thinking about ethical space, it's like, well, how do we know where we start? Well, we start at whatever level we're able to influence, whether it's at this very policy level, but we need to understand that all of these components that are coming into ethical space have different values and authorities associated with them. And once we understand that, then we're able to have a much more fulsome conversation. And it's not just about, well, I want to pick blueberries here. Well, we actually harvest blueberries here. We want to cut here. And actually then that's our watershed. It's like, well, what we should be talking about is, okay, well, if we have water law, we have water ceremony, that's really important. That law needs to be exactly the same as this highest level constitution or legislative law. So I hope that makes sense. It's sometimes challenging to try and explain that in a quick time frame. But now I think is the, sorry, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is somewhere where my cursor is not. Okay, no, that's still not working because pen is there. Okay, so now we're going to do breakouts, I think, still with the, unless I hear otherwise. What are your reactions and thoughts when you think about working with this conceptual framework? So there's a lot here. It's taken a lot of time to think about these things through my work, but it's something that may be useful in guiding your thinking about your the applicability of it to your work.
Sorry, Gwen, actually we don't have time for the breakout group, so if you would just proceed to your next slide, we need to wrap up.
Okay. That means that I went over time. Apologies, everyone. All right, so anyways, you can think about this question at your leisure. And in a couple slides, I'll show my contact information. I'm fully happy to have more in-depth conversations with people who are interested. Okay, so this is just something that I wanted to talk about when we're talking about systems. We just looked at sort of the systems framework before, and how we think about on a regional organizational strategy, how we change things, right? And so in the typical planning approach, or a lot of organizations are thinking about their theory of change, how things change, right? And so what happens in this typical context is that when you make a decision, then your systems will change. Like you'll influence a policy or a legislation, right? You're like, oh, okay, we're going to make a decision based on science, and it goes and influences the policy or legislation system. On the Indigenous side, the creation stories and protocols is that the system, the earth itself as a system, guides the decisions, right? So it's less about influencing the system than learning from the system and applying the decisions that were provided by the system, rather than trying to make decisions which then influence the system. So if the earth is a system and the legislative hierarchy is a system, those two things are different. So it's kind of another inversion here, right? Which is like, okay, if decisions influence systems, how do we think about systems influencing decisions? Right. And so it's just another inversion. It's trying to have these conversations about what assumptions we're bringing to ethical space when we're trying to achieve common goals, and we're really needing to develop solutions to the challenges that we articulate once we get to the space. Like all of those things is when I went through the work that I'm doing, it's like, well, how do we need to go? How deep do we have to go to develop this understanding, which will really result in reconciliation? And my point here is, if we don't go that deep, we won't achieve reconciliation, because the disparity between the authority inherent within society is so different, so dramatic, right? So that's, resolution, reconciliation is as deep as all that to me anyways. So then in wrapping up, I talked, in the work that we're doing, I really want to do work and move away from the rhetorical approach. And sometimes it seems slow, UNDRIP took 20 years or whatever. But how do we move forward if we're going to sort of think about our work in the context of this conceptual framework for dual authorities? And so what I would sort of invite you to think about is, well, what level am I working at? How can I influencing? How do I understand the system on the other side? And what more do I need to do to understand the Indigenous system of law and authority? And then secondly, principles-based approach. I understand the significance of knowledge. Like, we really need to put those principles into play, which allow for the exploration of those assumptions and the development of potentially new assumptions around what we're building when we build towards reconciliation. Of course, pragmatically understanding the capacity challenges and how we can support Indigenous capacity challenges is really critical. And then things take trust and they take time. So, this is long-standing work. It doesn't happen quickly. It's challenging to think about what could be, and it's challenging to understand what is, but that's the work that I think is really important to all of us these days. And again, there's my name, contact information, website. If you want to get in touch, happy to be in touch. Thanks so much, Candace. Thanks so much for all who are listening.
For those of us on phone, could you read out your contact info?
Oh yeah, Gwen Bridge. So Gwen, Gwen at GwenBridge.com, 250-826-2265. Then
so that's Gwen at GwenBridge.com.
Yeah, and then my website's GwenBridge.com. Yeah, so.
Okay.
So people have been asking in the chat if the recording will be made available. Absolutely, yes, it will. We do apologize for going a couple minutes over and not being able to have the second breakout. We're all learning about online platforms and how to work best with it. And also for the abrupt end to the breakout rooms, we want to remind people about the next session 2 weeks from today, also at 10 a.m., where we will have people from the Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air and Water giving a presentation. They're doing amazing work on Indigenous law. And Nadine is going to be emailing you with follow-ups, link to the recording, link to a short survey, an option to receive the Truth and Reconciliation booklet via mail, an option to have a short one-to-one follow-up conversation with us. We would really appreciate that, feedback in that sense, and some other key links as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.